Hey there, welcome to Sleepy History Secrets, the place where the world's most dramatic mistakes are whispered softly enough to fall asleep to. Tonight, we're following one small flower that grew into a 5,000-year story. A story of pain and profit, mercy and manipulation, dreams and dependence. It began as a medicine, became an empire, and ended up inside the human bloodstream, still pretending to be relief. Before we drift back in time, take a quiet moment to like the video or subscribe. Only if you truly enjoy falling asleep to the sound of humanity inventing new problems for itself. And tell me, in the comments, where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's strangely comforting to know that somewhere, someone is hearing this at 3 a.m, the same hour ancient doctors once called the breath between worlds. Now dim the lights, let the air grow calm. Maybe imagine the faint scent of earth after rain. You're standing in a field long before history learned to write its own name. Around you, tall green stems sway, crowned with delicate white flowers. When their pods are cut, a milky sap seeps out, thick, sweet, and faintly bitter. It's the world's first lullaby in liquid form. That sap is opium, and tonight we'll follow its trail from the clay tablets of Sumer to the smoke-filled ports of China, from Victorian pharmacies to modern laboratories. A journey through the centuries where every attempt to ease pain also found a way to sell it. If your mind drifts while listening, that's fine. The story itself drifts through temples, empires, and hospital corridors, always returning to the same small flower that taught humanity how to forget. So settle in. Let the quiet hum of history surround you. This is the complete history of opium, the drug plague that paralyzed empires. Long before nations or navies, before kings or currencies, there was pain. And wherever pain appeared, humans looked for something to soften its voice. Somewhere around the year 3400 before the Common Era, the Sumerians found it. They called it hul-gil, the plant of joy. You can picture them in the floodplains of Mesopotamia, cutting small slits into green pods under the desert sun. As the sap oozed out and dried, they scraped it off with bits of shell. They didn't call it chemistry, they called it mercy. The same hands that built the world's first cities also learned to harvest dreams from flowers. The clay tablets they left behind list barley, dates, and poppy among their crops. A tidy reflection of priorities: food, sweetness, and forgetfulness. In temple rituals, priests may have mixed the latex with beer or honey to dull pain or invite visions. The smell would have been earthy, slightly sweet, something between fresh rain and smoke. By the time the Egyptians inherited the secret, they treated the plant as part of their grand pharmacy. The Ebers Papyrus, written around 1500 before Christ, describes mixtures for calming children, soothing coughs, and silencing sorrow. Imagine a small child crying in a reed hut beside the Nile. A mother dips her finger into a dark paste and whispers a prayer. Relief, if it came, would feel like the desert wind slowing down. In ancient markets, bundles of dried poppy heads traded alongside frankincense and copper. The plant was light to carry and easy to worship, a useful combination in every age, and like most useful things, it spread fast. Caravans carried it east toward Persia and west toward the Mediterranean, where the Greeks waited with a talent for giving names to everything. They called it opium, meaning juice. To them, the sap was both medicine and metaphor. Homer wrote of Nepenthe, a drink that chases away grief. No one knows exactly what was in it, but scholars suspect poppy among the ingredients. It's oddly comforting to think that even mythical heroes needed something stronger than courage. Centuries later, Hippocrates approached it more clinically. He noted that the juice could stop pain, quiet coughing, and sometimes stop breathing too. He did not have the words respiratory depression. He just wrote that the breath slows and sleep deepens. a poetic diagnosis for a chemical fact. The Romans took this knowledge and added logistics. Under their empire, opium moved across continents like a disciplined army of tiny brown pellets. Physicians used it for headaches, surgeries, or heartbreaks, often without much distinction between them. Galen, the court doctor, called it a gift from the gods, but warned that all gifts demand respect. He was right, of course, though it would take another 2,000 years for anyone to listen. At the height of Rome, opium was as common as olive oil. It came in jars sealed with wax, labelled in Latin, and sold in market stalls between spices and perfumes. Soldiers took it on campaigns. Poets took it for inspiration. Everyone else took it because it worked. The empire's roads didn't just carry armies, they carried the recipe for relief. Picture a Roman household at night. Oil lamps flicker, the city outside hums faintly, and on a table sits a small bowl of brown paste. Someone dips a finger, takes a breath, and the day's pain begins to blur. For a few hours the empire sleeps. When the Western world eventually collapsed, the knowledge of that sleep did not. It drifted eastward, across deserts and mountains, carried by scholars, merchants, and memory itself. Every civilization that met the poppy believed it was discovering it for the first time. None of them realized they were inheriting a habit already 5 millennia old. Some plants feed the body, others feed the imagination. This one, inconveniently, feeds both and charges interest. By the time the Greeks inherited the poppy from the East, it had already learned how to whisper to humans in their own languages. The Greeks listened carefully, as they tended to do with everything that promised meaning. To them, it wasn't just a plant. It was a conversation between the body and the soul, the kind of conversation that begins as a prayer and ends as a prescription. The Greeks believed all pain had a purpose. Even so, they were not above negotiating with it. In Homer's Odyssey, Helen of Troy slips a powder called nepenthe into the wine of guests who cannot stop grieving. The name means anti-sorrow, or literally no grief. Scholars still debate what nepenthe contained, but given the era's fondness for herbal experiments, opium is the most likely guest at that mythological dinner party. It's an oddly human image, someone passing around a cup of comfort, as if forgetting we're an art form. The philosopher Theophrastus, a student of Aristotle, wrote about the poppy with the same detached curiosity he applied to thunderstorms and frogs. He noted that when the pods were cut and the sap collected, it produced a dark juice that could ease suffering but might also bring endless sleep. He was describing, unknowingly, the line between medicine and poison, the line humanity keeps blurring with hopeful precision. Then came Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, though he would likely have preferred moderately responsible uncle. He stripped the plant of divine mystery and filed it neatly under pharmacy. To him, opium was neither sacred nor sinful. It was simply one of nature's tools. He used it to quiet coughs, soothe fevers, and steady the shaking hands of the dying. But even Hippocrates, pragmatic as he was, recognized that the same flower that comforted could also betray. He wrote that the juice brings sleep, and when sleep is too long, brings the end of it. It was his gentle way of saying, too much rest can be permanent. By the time of Galen, several centuries later, the Roman Empire had turned medicine into an organized profession and trade into an art form. Rome was a city that believed everything valuable should exist in bulk: knowledge, gold, soldiers, or narcotics. Opium travelled through its ports in small clay jars sealed with beeswax, often labelled in Greek because that made them sound more trustworthy. A physician might buy a batch near the Tiber, measure it on bronze scales and mix it with honey or wine before sending it home with a patient. It was the original take-home therapy. No warning labels, no consultation fee, just relief in a jar. Galen himself, who treated emperors and gladiators alike, considered opium indispensable. He described it as divine, not in worship but in accuracy. It simply worked. A few grains of dried sap could still the body's revolt, calm fever, and erase the day's noise. But he also warned that it dulled more than pain, it softened the will. He wrote, "That which numbs the body may also numb the soul." Centuries later, modern neurologists would describe the same effect in charts and diagrams, but Galen captured it in a single sentence of melancholy brilliance. Roman households kept small pouches of the powder near their lamps. Soldiers carried it in their kits, sailors in their chests. Mothers used it on children when fevers rose and prayers grew tired. There was even a drink, poppy steeped in wine, served in taverns to those who couldn't afford philosophers. It was not just medicine, it was consolation in liquid form. If the gods had built the world imperfectly, at least they had given humans a way to sleep through its rough edges. Picture a night in Rome around the year 150. The streets are quiet, the last vendors packing up amphorae of olives and grain. Inside a small house, a physician named Lucius measures out a portion of opium. The patient is coughing blood from a winter illness. There are no antibiotics, no theories about bacteria, only faith in balance, in humours, and in substances that make pain fade. The mixture is dark, almost black. Lucius stirs it into warm wine and watches the patient's breathing slow, then even out. Outside, the city hums softly. Inside, one more mortal finds temporary peace. It was easy in such moments to mistake relief for recovery. Empires often do. The Romans conquered so efficiently that even their remedies travelled faster than most diseases. By the 3rd century, opium was known from the Sahara to the Scottish Highlands. It was traded by weight, taxed by emperors, and recommended by doctors who barely remembered where it came from. The flower had become a citizen of the world, portable, profitable, and quiet. Yet beneath the calm surface, something curious was happening. The more civilization advanced, the more it needed sleep. Wars, roads, politics, and ambition all produced pain in quantities medicine had never seen before. Opium became the empire's invisible infrastructure, the soft engine behind endurance. It numbed the soldiers enough to keep marching, and the thinkers enough to keep thinking. Pain was managed, but not cured. The world had discovered the comfort of maintenance. When Rome finally fractured under its own weight, knowledge scattered but did not disappear. Scholars carried their books east to Persia, to Baghdad and beyond. With them went the recipes and the stories, the poppy seeds tucked between pages, both literal and metaphorical. In the dark centuries that followed, Europe forgot many of its own sciences, but the East remembered. There, in the libraries of scholars and the apothecaries of physicians, the plant would find new names, new theories, and new uses. It would survive, as it always did, by adapting. Every age believes it has invented progress. In truth, it mostly redistributes memory. The Greeks taught medicine to respect logic. The Romans taught it to scale. And the poppy taught them both that every cure contains its own echo. Somewhere, beyond the fading edges of empire, the seeds waited, small, silent, and patient. They had no need for armies or philosophy. They only needed people to keep hurting, and history would take care of the rest. When Europe was sleeping through its own dark centuries, light pooled quietly in the east. The trade winds carried not just silk and spices, but ideas. In the cities of Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba, where libraries outnumbered taverns, scholars began the patient work of saving what the ancient world had nearly lost. And among the scrolls and translations, the poppy returned. Still a medicine, still a mystery, but now under new supervision. They called it afyun in Arabic, a word soft on the tongue, heavy in meaning. In the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, scholars translated the Greek and Roman medical texts into Arabic, line by careful line. What began as Galen's divine remedy became part of an expanding science of observation and logic. The physician Al-Razi, known in the West as Razors, read those translations and began to test them. He did something radical for his time. He doubted authority. If Hippocrates had said a drug worked, Al-Razi would try it himself to see if the patient agreed. He found that opium could dull the pain of surgery and childbirth, and that it worked best when inhaled gently rather than swallowed whole. Some accounts describe how surgeons would soak cloth in a mixture of wine, herbs, and opium, then press it over a patient's face until the body went still. It wasn't perfect anaesthesia, more a haze than a blackout, but it was the closest the medieval world had to mercy before the scalpel. You can almost imagine the scene: the low light of oil lamps, the scent of resin and vinegar, the soft murmur of a prayer, and a silence deep enough to cut through. Al-Razi warned that this strange gift could turn cruel if left unchecked. He wrote that too much dulls the soul and chills the heart, which modern medicine would translate as respiratory failure, though the phrase chilled heart feels more accurate. He spoke of addiction before the word existed, describing patients who returned again and again, not for pain, but for peace. His advice was clinical and compassionate. Use what nature gives, but never trust its kindness. Another great mind, Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, refined those warnings a century later. In his Canon of Medicine, a vast encyclopedia that would guide physicians for half a millennium, he listed opium among the strongest drugs known to man. He wrote of its uses for headaches, fevers, and the anguish of the mind, but he also noted the danger of what he called sleep beyond waking. He even described the first recorded case of overdose, a man who took too much of the dark extract and didn't rise again. In simple words, he had recognized the narrow doorway between relief and ruin. Avicenna understood balance as both science and philosophy. He saw the body as a city, the heart a ruler, the lungs the messengers, the brain the treasurer of reason. To him, drugs were diplomats between these regions, negotiating temporary peace. Too much diplomacy, of course, can topple a state. His caution became famous: every remedy is a poison in excess. Modern pharmacology would later name this principle the dose makes the poison, but Avicenna had already said it more elegantly 1,000 years earlier. While scholars experimented in their laboratories, merchants carried their discoveries across the known world. Through the deserts of Persia, camel caravans moved between oases, their cargoes wrapped in linen and sealed with wax. Bundled among the spices and lapis lazuli were jars of powdered poppy, labelled for export. In the markets of Samarkand, traders sold it beside cinnamon and frankincense. To a buyer in China or India, it arrived as both medicine and myth. You could call it global trade, or you could call it destiny on a camel's back. What set this Islamic age apart was its refusal to separate faith and reason. A physician could quote the Quran in one breath and list opium dosages in the next. They believed that studying nature was a form of devotion, that to measure the world was to honour its maker, and yet, even they saw the plant's shadow. Al-Biruni, another scholar of the era, noted that opium confers happiness at first and then grief, as though joy itself had a half-life. He observed that those who used it often lost interest in everything else: food, family, ambition. The mind dimmed, the will softened. It was not sin, he said, but imbalance. The cure for pain had begun to create its own disease. Still, the plant was too valuable to abandon. Physicians in Persia prescribed it for nearly every ailment: toothache, cough, melancholy, and even the sorrow of widows. They mixed it with honey, mint, or saffron to disguise the bitterness. A travelling apothecary might sell dozens of such preparations, each with its own poetic name. The draught of night, the silence of the heart. Medicine, after all, sells best when it sounds like comfort. The influence of these scholars would stretch far beyond their lifetimes. Their writings reached Europe through Spain and Sicily, where translators rendered Arabic back into Latin. By the 13th century, students at the University of Salerno were studying Avicenna's canon alongside Galen's treatises. For the next 500 years, a prescription for opium would look almost identical to one written in Baghdad centuries earlier. The Middle Ages had become a bridge of borrowed wisdom. But knowledge, like any good story, tends to wander. As traders and empires rose and fell, the poppy's latex continued its quiet pilgrimage eastward, toward India, toward China, toward a new kind of appetite. What had once been a carefully measured powder would soon be boiled, smoked, and sold by the chest. The plant was about to meet commerce on its grandest stage. For now, though, in the calm before that storm, it existed in balance. The scholars of the Islamic world treated opium not as a temptation, but as a lesson. It taught precision, humility, and restraint, virtues that, ironically, history would forget the moment Prophet entered the room. The libraries of Baghdad would one day burn, their ashes scattered across the Tigris, but the poppy, as always, would survive the fire. It waited quietly for the next civilization to think it had discovered it. The Silk Road was never a single road, of course. It was more like a living web stitched together by traders, wanderers, and the occasional optimist who thought crossing an entire desert on a camel sounded like a reasonable career move. Along that network of dust and hope, something delicate and powerful began to travel. A white flower whose sap could turn suffering into silence. By the 8th century, caravans moving from the Middle East toward China carried bundles of dried poppy heads beside sacks of saffron, silk, and spices. To the merchants, it was simply another commodity, light to carry and valuable to anyone with nerves or lungs. In the ledgers of ancient traders, opium often appeared under names that sounded more poetic than medical. The sleep gift, the night's honey, or the foreign dream. It was good business disguised as compassion, which, history suggests, is the safest disguise of all. Travelling east, the poppy crossed empires like a polite guest who never left. In Persia, it was a comfort for the weary. In India, it became a ritual for kings. The Mughal emperors would one day serve opium mixed with rosewater at court banquets, a liquid applause for victory and leisure. But long before that, its roots had already settled deep into Indian soil. Farmers in the north began growing the poppy not just for medicine but for income. The flower adapted easily to warm plains and uncertain politics. In the ports of the Arabian Sea, ships carried opium east toward the Malay archipelago and the coast of China. There, it was known as a fuyung, a foreign medicine with both blessing and curse. Chinese physicians in the Tang dynasty prescribed it in small doses to stop diarrhea, soothe coughing, and treat insomnia. For centuries it stayed in the pharmacy, not the parlour. It was medicine, not recreation, an herbal tool with divine patience. But every medicine waits for its moment of misunderstanding. The Silk Road didn't just move goods, it moved habits. Alongside silk and paper, it exported the human belief that comfort should never be rationed. Small shops in the Chinese ports of Guangzhou and Quanzhou began selling opium more freely, often mixed into teas and tonics. A travelling scholar might sip it after a long journey, a merchant might take it before one. The plant was becoming cosmopolitan, its Latin name forgotten, its reputation still polite. If you imagine that era in slow motion, it looks almost innocent. The caravans move under wide skies, camels shuffle like patient ghosts through the dunes, bells jingle softly. Every mile or so there's a rest stop, caravanserai, where traders share stories, meals, and occasionally a sip of something stronger. Somewhere in that gentle rhythm, opium slipped quietly from being medicine to being companionship. It was not yet the scandal of empires, only a whisper at the edge of trade. By the 10th century, Chinese doctors were writing of opium as both remedy and risk. They called it the medicine that calms 10,000 anxieties, and also the medicine that shortens life. You could say they saw both sides of the flower, the mercy and the debt. Most people ignored the second part, as people usually do when relief is on sale. Meanwhile, on the other side of Asia, Arab merchants were growing wealthy on the same trade. Their ships crossed the Indian Ocean with monsoon winds, their sails filled with more than air, filled with the quiet promise that the world would always need comfort. In the markets of Zanzibar, Yemen, and Gujarat, jars of opium changed hands beneath banners of spices and pearls. To most observers, it looked like prosperity. Only the apothecaries noticed what prosperity smelled like: a faint sweetness, earthy and bitter, that clung to every ledger and robe. The genius of the Silk Road was its ability to make pain someone else's business. Each link in the chain believed it was merely passing along a product, not a problem. A farmer sold the pods to a trader. The trader sold them to a healer, and the healer sold them to a patient who never met any of the above. No single person felt responsible, and that anonymity, then as now, was the perfect climate for addiction to bloom. It would take centuries before the world realised that the real Silk Road wasn't made of silk at all, but of temptation wrapped in cotton and carried by mules. The caravans didn't just bridge continents, they connected supply and suffering in one long, profitable equation. Though no one dared to write it down that way. Still, for all its quiet dangers, opium also became a vessel for knowledge. Along with the drug came stories, formulas, and fragments of science. Buddhist monks carried healing recipes east to Japan. Persian scholars sent commentaries west to Spain. The flower's reputation evolved with every translation: divine, medical, exotic, scandalous. Each culture added its own adjective, and none were wrong. At night, when the caravans stopped in a desert camps, traders might share a small pipe or a drink mixed with the brown powder, not to escape reality but to blur its edges. They would sit under stars so bright they looked like the punctures of heaven, and talk about distant cities, forgotten wars, and the price of pepper. Someone might play a string instrument softly, its notes dissolving into the dry air. For a few hours they were all the same, men suspended between exhaustion and peace, warmed by fire and the faint comfort of the poppy. By the time dawn touched the dunes, the haze would lift, the saddles creak, and the caravan would move again. Another day, another border, another quiet exchange. None of them knew that their cargo would one day ignite wars, divide nations, and build fortunes that smelled faintly of flowers and ash. But history rarely announces its turning points. They happen in whispers, in trade ledgers, in the slow drift of habits. The Silk Road's greatest export was not silk or spices. It was the idea that pain could be managed, packaged, and sold. That idea would grow, take root in the fertile lands of India, and bloom again under a new empire that saw in this gentle flower something more than medicine. Profit. Somewhere beyond the horizon, ships were already waiting. By the time the poppy reached India in full bloom, it had already learned to speak the language of empire. It didn't arrive as a flower. It arrived as a system, an organised promise of pleasure, peace, and revenue. The Mughals, who built marble palaces that glowed like moonlight and gardens that defied the desert, were not the sort of rulers to ignore such a convenient source of both comfort and control. In the 16th century, the empire of Akbar the Great stretched across most of northern India. He ruled a civilization that loved symmetry, in architecture, in law, and naturally in intoxication. The imperial court drank wine, chewed betel, and smoked what they called afim, the Persian word for opium. The emperor himself was known for moderation, a word which, in royal circles, usually means whatever he wanted, but politely. Opium was not just medicine here, it was etiquette. To offer a guest a sip of poppy-lace sherbet was to wish him peace and prosperity. Refusing it was almost rude. Courtly poets praised its ability to cool the heart and sharpen the wit, a combination that probably worked better in poetry than in real life. Outside the palace, the flower's second career began, that of a civil servant. The Mughal administration, ever practical, recognised the plant's economic potential. It taxed cultivation, licensed its sale, and kept detailed records that would make modern accountants blush. The same bureaucratic precision that counted soldiers and peasants now counted poppy pods. Even the fields became imperial property, and the flower, once a wild bloom of compassion, now wore the badge of a taxpayer. Farmers in Bihar, Bengal and Malwa found that poppy cultivation paid better than wheat. The soil liked it, and the officials liked it even more. Year by year, the empire expanded its network of state shops, where customers could buy opium under government supervision. The product was weighed in bronze scales, sealed with wax, and labelled with the emperor's mark, a royal guarantee that your dreams were both pure and taxable. The social map of India began to change. In markets, storytellers and traders gathered around smoking dens. The air shimmered with the smell of spice, sweat, and slow-burning resin. A few coins could buy an afternoon of serenity, a night of forgetfulness, or an unfortunate lifetime of both. Meanwhile, merchants noticed something remarkable. Wherever the poppy went, silver followed. Coastal ports in Gujarat and Calcutta started exporting opium to Southeast Asia and China. The profits flowed back like a river of bright metal. The empire's treasuries grew heavy, and its ethics grew light. But as with all empires, someone else was watching. The British East India Company, originally a polite association of merchants from London, had been quietly transforming itself into one of history's strangest hybrids, part corporation, part army, and entirely ambitious. By the 18th century, it had discovered the Mughal secret, that controlling pain could also control people. When the company gained influence over Bengal after the Battle of Plassey in 1757, it inherited not only the land but its most profitable crop. The British didn't have to invent the opium trade, they simply nationalised it under new management. They expanded production, established state monopolies, and auctioned the harvest in Calcutta to private traders who sailed it east. It was efficiency disguised as civilization. Still, in the Mughal heartlands, the old customs lingered. Farmers continued to harvest sap under the same sun that had watched over their ancestors. Labourers cut the pods at dawn when the air was cool and the latex thickened like honey. They scraped it carefully into small clay pots, letting it dry until it turned dark and fragrant. For many families, it was their only reliable income. You might call it subsistence. The officials called it duty paid. In the villages, opium remained a social equaliser. The poor smoked it to forget hunger. The rich drank it to digest feasts. In some places, it became a folk medicine for everything from snakebite to heartbreak. The line between remedy and recreation blurred until it stopped existing altogether. Mothers gave infants a pinch to quiet their cries, never realising they were teaching sleep to imitate death. What's striking about this period is how calm it all seemed. There were no moral panics, no sermons against the drug, no declarations of national decay. The empire treated opium as a fact of life, like monsoon or tax season. The flower had been fully domesticated. It paid rent, funded armies, and decorated poetry. The harmony felt complete. But harmony in history usually means someone is about to ruin it. As the East India Company tightened its grip, opium became less about pleasure and more about power. The British calculated that selling it to China could fix their trade imbalance, a polite phrase meaning they wanted tea without paying for it. The Mughal Empire, already crumbling, couldn't stop them. The flower that once floated, in cups at royal banquets, was about to fuel gunboats and global crises. Yet within India, everyday life went on. Farmers still sowed the seeds in winter, watered the fields with measured care, and prayed for a gentle spring. Children played among the white blossoms, unaware that each petal was part of a far larger story, one that would stretch from their villages to the harbours of Canton and the battlefields of empire. In the evenings, smoke from countless cooking fires mingled with the faint, bitter-sweet scent of poppy resin. Families sat together, tired but alive, their futures quietly written in the next harvest. For them, Opium was not politics or profit. It was survival in a fragrant disguise. From the terraces of Agra to the alleyways of Calcutta, the empire of dreams had found its rhythm. And somewhere beyond the horizon, ships were already loading their cargo, wooden hulls creaking under the weight of a flower that would soon change the world's balance sheet. The British would call it trade, the Chinese would call it poison, and history, as usual, would call it inevitable. When the first chests of Indian opium reached China, they arrived politely, wrapped in hemp cloth and optimism. Officially, it was medicine. Unofficially, it was a business plan written in powder. China already had its own ancient pharmacy, meticulous, spiritual, and confident. The empire needed nothing, or so it believed. Then came the flower that promised better dreams. At first, opium entered China like a guest at a banquet, quietly, respectfully, and seated at the far end of the table. In the 16th century, it appeared in the ledgers of Ming apothecaries as a rare import, mixed with herbs to ease coughing or help the elderly sleep. But as with all guests who bring comfort, it didn't stay rare for long. When the Portuguese arrived by sea and the British followed by trade, the plant found a faster route into Chinese lungs, and the empire found a slower decline. The turning point came not from medicine, but from innovation. Sometime in the 1600s, someone, no one knows who, though it's tempting to imagine an impatient alchemist or a bored sailor, decided to mix opium with tobacco and smoke it. The effect was immediate, smooth, and alarmingly pleasant. It bypassed the slow digestion of pills and potions. The relief came in seconds, not hours. And just like that, the poppy changed personality. It stopped being a doctor and became an entertainer. The mixture was called Madak, a crude blend at first, smoked in clay pipes among coastal traders and sailors. But as centuries turned, refinement followed greed. The crude paste evolved into shandu, pure, potent, carefully prepared opium heated over small lamps and inhaled through long bamboo pipes. The rituals around it grew elaborate. There were mats of woven grass, trays of polished brass, and attendants who heated the drug with the precision of jewellers. The smoke curled, gracefully like calligraphy in the air. In the southern ports, opium dens multiplied as fast as tea houses. Men reclined in silence, each lost in a slow-moving cloud of warmth and forgetfulness. To an outsider, it looked like peace. To an official, it looked like decline. Either way, it was profitable. By the 1700s, British traders in Canton realised that the Chinese would exchange nearly anything for the imported drug: silver, porcelain, silk, labour, even their health. The silver that had once flowed into China for tea and ceramics now began to flow out again, ton by ton, into British coffers. Economists later called this the silver drain. The people who lived through it simply called it hunger. The Qing government saw the danger clearly. In 1729, Emperor Yongzheng issued the first ban on opium smoking and trade, describing it as a pernicious custom. But customs are hard to ban when they are also habits. The demand did not vanish, it went underground. Merchants bribed local officials looked the other way, and the drug kept flowing up the rivers, across provinces, and into every class of society. What began as medicine for the rich became a necessity for the poor. By 1800, the empire was both magnificent and uneasy. On paper, it remained the centre of civilization. In reality, its veins were humming with addiction. Soldiers smoked to forget the marches, scholars smoked to think longer, and labourers smoked because it was cheaper than rest. The habit became a culture, and the culture became an economy. To feed that economy, the British East India Company ramped up production in Bengal. Opium auctions in Calcutta became famous for their scale and their irony. Clerks in powdered wigs selling the tools of intoxication with the precision of accountants. Private ships known as country traders carried the cargo east to Canton, dodging Chinese patrols and delivering profit by the chest. The entire operation was technically illegal and practically unstoppable. Inside China, addiction blossomed like an inverted garden. Bright on the surface, rotting underneath. Reports describe officials attending morning meetings half dreaming, their fingers stained from pipes. Families sold heirlooms to feed the habit. Farmers pawned tools for another pipe. The government issued edicts, punishments, and moral appeals, but enforcement melted faster than the smoke it chased. In cities like Guangzhou, opium dens became both refuge and ruin. They were decorated with silk curtains, low beds, and small lamps flickering beside porcelain trays. Clients reclined on cushions, pipes balanced delicately between their fingers. The act of smoking was ceremonial, almost sacred. The breath drawn slow, held and released like a private prayer. For a few heartbeats, the world stopped being an empire and became a room filled with sighs. Not everyone condemned it. Some poets called the experience borrowed immortality. They wrote of dreams, within dreams, of colours that seemed to hum, of time that folded like silk. In those verses, opium wasn't a vice but a doorway, a quiet rebellion against a world too strict, too hierarchical, too awake. But poetry rarely pays taxes, and the empire had bills to settle. By the early 19th century, the Qing treasury was draining, silver prices were collapsing, and the court finally decided enough was enough. In 1839, the emperor appointed a determined official, Lin Zexu, to end the trade once and for all. He wrote a famous letter to Queen Victoria, polite, moral, and futile, asking how Britain could justify selling poison to another nation while banning it at home. There was no reply. Instead, British gunboats began to gather off the coast. The flower that had once floated quietly down rivers now sailed on waves of the war. But before the cannons fired, there was still a strange stillness in the air, the kind of calm that comes before consequences. In the dens, the lamps still glowed softly. The smoke rose, curled, and disappeared, as if the poppy itself were sighing. Outside, history was sharpening its knives. Inside, men and women dreamed of peace that would soon be mistaken for surrender. Opium had done what no army could. It had entered the empire without knocking, conquered without marching, and made everyone think it was their idea. By 1839, the empire that once called itself the Middle Kingdom was beginning to feel the middle of everything: trade, temptation, and humiliation. Along the southern coast, in the city of Canton, the air smelled of rain and resentment. Ships crowded the harbour, their sails hanging limp in the humidity. Inside the warehouses, thousands of wooden chests sat stacked in quiet defiance, each one filled with brown powder, medicine to some, poison to others, fortune to everyone in between. It was into this uneasy balance that Commissioner Lin Zexu arrived, sent by the emperor with a mission that sounded simple enough: stop the opium trade. Lin was an idealist, which in the 19th century was already a dangerous profession. He believed in duty, order, and the idea that moral conviction could outmuscle global capitalism. His letters still read like a blend of poetry and policy, written in the tone of a man trying to reason with a storm. He began by doing the reasonable thing, asking nicely. In a letter addressed to Queen Victoria, Lin questioned why Britain, a supposedly civilized nation, banned opium at home while flooding China with it abroad. He wrote, "Surely your heart must know this is unjust." The letter, carried by diplomatic channels, was read, admired for its elegance, and filed away, somewhere between curiosity and inconvenience. When politeness failed, Lin turned to action. He ordered the seizure of more than 20,000 chests of opium, roughly the weight of an ocean's patience. The crates were dragged from warehouses and stacked along the coast at human, forming walls of wood and greed. Over several days, workers broke them open, mixed the contents with lime and salt water, and let the tide carry the dark mixture away. The scene, if painted, would have looked like repentance. Grey skies, pale waves, and men ankle-deep in the Empire's addiction. Britain's merchants were outraged, not morally, but financially. They demanded compensation, not apology. In London, the argument reached Parliament, where voices rose not over ethics but over economics. Some condemned the trade as vile, others defended it as vital. In the end, the logic of profit won, as it usually does. Britain dispatched a fleet of modern warships to protect its interests, which translated softly meant to ensure that its customers remained loyal. When the gunboats appeared off the Chinese coast, they looked like small moving fortresses, iron hearts powered by steam and justification. The Qing Navy, still sailing on wind and pride, had no chance. Cannons thundered across the misty harbours of Canton and the Pearl River Delta. The noise was not only the sound of war, but of the industrial age introducing itself. For the Chinese soldiers, it was bewildering. Their gunpowder was handmade, their cannons short-ranged, their ships built more for ceremony than combat. Lin Zexu's courage was genuine, but courage doesn't deflect iron. Within months, the British had taken control of key ports. The war was less a battle than a demonstration, a lesson in what happens when tradition meets machinery. In 1842, the defeated empire signed the Treaty of Nanjing, an agreement written in legal ink and lingering humiliation. The treaty forced China to open 5 ports to British trade, pay a large indemnity in silver, and cede Hong Kong in perpetuity. The phrase sounds elegant until you realise it translates roughly as forever until you can do something about it. The British called it diplomacy. The Chinese called it exhaustion. Silver, which had once flowed into China in steady, shining rivers, now flowed out again, back to London, back to the coffers that had funded the invasion. It was as if guilt itself had been melted down and shipped home in bars of metal. The Emperor dismissed Lin for failing to stop the inevitable, though history would later restore his dignity. Back in England, newspapers framed the war as a triumph for free trade. The irony was thick enough to spread on toast. Politicians spoke of civilization, progress, and the moral duty of opening markets. They didn't mention what was inside those markets. The public, distanced by oceans, pictured distant lands and exotic smoke, never quite realizing that the comfort in their teacups had been purchased with another nation's despair. Meanwhile, in China, the habit refused to die. The government's victory proclamations were printed on paper that smelled faintly of opium smoke. Traders found new routes, smugglers new tricks, and addicts new excuses. The empire had lost a war, but the poppy had won a continent. Lin Zexu spent his remaining years governing distant provinces, writing essays on virtue, and trying not to think about the tide he couldn't turn. In one letter, he wrote, "Heaven may forgive mistakes, but not persistence in them." It's a line that might serve as an epitaph for humanity's entire relationship with the poppy. As the years passed, the British built their settlement in Hong Kong, a rocky island that would become the new gateway for trade and temptation. Its harbour filled with warehouses, merchants and missionaries, all convinced they were improving the world. They were perhaps improving their profits even faster. And somewhere behind the fog and the ledgers, the poppy bloomed again, quietly triumphant. It had learned that war, like addiction, always finds a way to repeat itself. The rain over Canton eventually stopped. The gunboats sailed away, their decks scrubbed clean, their crews already dreaming of new markets. The Empire of China, humbled but unbroken, tried to rebuild. The British, pleased with their victory, prepared to industrialise the same war all over again. History had discovered something dangerously efficient, the cycle of outrage, resistance, and treaty, a formula that could be applied anywhere pain and profit met. For now, the sea was calm, the papers signed, and the warehouses open again. The world called it peace. The poppy called it opportunity. The guns fell silent in 1842, but silence is rarely peace. The Treaty of Nanjing had turned China into an open wound with ports. British merchants went back to business with the cheerful indifference that only victors can manage. The warehouses refilled, the pipes were lit again, and the flour resumed its quiet work. For the next decade, China tried to breathe through smoke. By mid-century, opium was no longer a scandal. It was a statistic. Imports rose each year like a chart of collective denial. British traders called it stability. Chinese officials called it surrender. But history prefers the neutral term trade. The world as usual moved on. Steamships replaced sails, telegrams replaced patience, and the empire that once fought to keep its ports closed now had them pried open like a patient under surgery. The British called it modernisation. The Chinese called it exhaustion. The poppy called it progress. Then, as if one humiliation weren't sufficient, came the sequel no one asked for, the Second Opium War. It began, as such things often do, with something small and stupid. In 1856, Chinese authorities boarded a ship called the Arrow, suspected of piracy and flying the British flag without permission. They arrested the crew. Britain, eager for another moral crisis with commercial benefits, claimed outrage. A flag had been insulted, cannons were polished, diplomats dusted off their indignation. This time, France joined the campaign, citing the death of a missionary as pretext. The two nations marched together under the banners of civilization, armed with rifles, steamships, and sermon-like speeches about justice. It was, by any measure, an industrial war against a pre-industrial pride. The fighting stretched from Canton to Beijing. Villages burned quietly. Chinese troops, brave but badly equipped, fought with swords against steel. The British wrote home about the picturesque scenery. The French collected souvenirs. And somewhere behind the smoke, clerks tallied shipments of opium still moving upriver. When Beijing fell in 1860, the invading soldiers entered the Summer Palace, a sprawling complex of gardens, temples, and lakes, once called the Garden of Perfect Brightness. What they did next was neither perfect nor bright. They looted the art, the furniture, the books, the porcelain. What they couldn't carry, they burned. Witnesses said the flames lit the sky for days, turning marble and silk to ash. It was described as retribution for Chinese resistance. It was, in truth, the human tendency to mistake destruction for justice. A British officer later wrote that the looting was a regrettable necessity. Regret, it seemed, was the empire's most abundant export. The resulting Treaty of Tientsin made the previous one look merciful. It legalised the opium trade, opened more ports, and granted foreigners the right to live, work, and preach wherever they pleased. The idea of extraterritoriality, meaning that foreigners in China would be governed by their own laws, not Chinese ones, turned entire districts into little copies of Europe. The Chinese called them treaty ports. History might more accurately call them least illusions. Hong Kong became the empire's glittering front office, while Shanghai grew into its neon accounting department. The streets filled with tea merchants, missionaries, bankers, and brothels, all working side by side in perfect hypocrisy. The opium dens flourished, not in back alleys but in full daylight. A foreign gentleman could attend church in the morning, conduct a profitable transaction by noon, and end the evening reclining in a haze of imported satisfaction. Civilization apparently ran on schedule. In the West, the profits were astonishing. London's financial district thrived on the silver flowing back from Asia. Elegant townhouses were built on it. Universities were funded by it. No one liked to mention the source. In Parliament, a few moral voices rose again to question the trade, but they were easily outvoted by those who had investments to protect. It was, as one politician put it, unfortunate but unavoidable. Most policies of the 19th century could have worn the same label. Across the ocean in the United States, merchants found their own opportunities. American traders imported opium from the Ottoman Empire to refine into morphine and patent medicines. Chinese immigrant communities, especially in California, brought their own customs, including opium smoking, with them. Soon, American cities had their own dens, complete with low couches, dim lamps, and the faint rattle of pipes. The public's response was predictably uneven. When the smokers were Chinese, it was a vice. When they were white, it was therapeutic. Legislators began drafting early anti-drug laws not out of concern for health, but out of fear of foreigners. The first Western drug policies were essentially acts of xenophobia disguised as reform. Civilization once again regulating its own temptation, but only when the temptation changed colour. Meanwhile, back in China, the social fabric continued to fray. Entire provinces struggled with addiction. Officials lamented the loss of discipline among soldiers and workers. Temples were converted into clinics. Families sold heirlooms to pay for habits. Yet the trade continued stronger than ever, protected by treaties and tariffs. The poppy had achieved something rare in nature: legal immortality. Every system involved in the business, imperial, commercial, medical, insisted it was doing the right thing. The merchants spoke of free markets, the missionaries of free souls, the doctors of free sleep, and the addicts, who had none of these freedoms, smoked quietly and disappeared. By the end of the century, China's image abroad was that of a sleeping giant, a phrase as cruel as it was literal. The world saw an empire lost in dreams and mist, not realizing who had sold them both. The poppy had grown from field to empire to metaphor. It had become a lesson written in smoke, that every civilization believes it can manage pleasure, until pleasure starts managing civilization. In the rain-slick streets of Shanghai, a British merchant once wrote home to his wife, "The nights are beautiful here. The air smells of jasmine and something else I can't name. It was the smell of empire, sweet, heavy, and impossible to wash away." By the time the 19th century reached its velvet middle, the great battles over ports and treaties had faded into drawing-room chatter. Empires no longer needed gunboats to move opium, they only needed glass bottles and printed labels. The poppy had gone domestic. It was no longer a scandal of foreign policy, it was a comfort sitting quietly on the nightstand. Europe, and especially Britain, had turned the chemistry of conquest into a household habit. The word laudanum became its polite disguise. It sounded elegant, almost musical, something you might sip at a piano recital rather than during an existential crisis. Its recipe was simple: opium dissolved in alcohol, sometimes sweetened with wine or honey. The mixture was dark, viscous, and faintly aromatic. A syrup that smelled faintly of old fruit and secrets. Paracelsus, the Renaissance physician who adored both experiments and danger, first gave it its name. A few centuries later, the English doctor Thomas Sydenham refined the formula into what he called the most valuable medicine in the world. And who could argue? A few drops could quiet pain, slow the lungs, soften grief, or, with only slightly more enthusiasm, stop the heart altogether. In the language of advertising, it promised everything. By the 1700s, laudanum was being sold in apothecaries across Europe. By the 1800s, it was sold everywhere else too. The bottles came in elegant shapes: amber glass, corked and labelled in neat copper plate script. The labels promised relief for coughs, cramps, melancholy, toothaches, sleeplessness, and the vague, aching loneliness of modern life. They did not mention dependence, because the concept had not yet been invented. Every home had a bottle. So did every poet. It was the era of over-the-counter dreams. In London, Paris, and Edinburgh, writers began to discover that a few spoonfuls of laudanum could turn insomnia into inspiration. Coleridge claimed it helped him imagine Kubla Khan's pleasure dome. De Quincey turned his dependency into a bestseller, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, which managed the rare trick of making addiction sound both terrifying and fashionable. Romantics called it insight. Pharmacists called it repeat business. The beauty of laudanum was its versatility. It could be taken by the teaspoon or the pint. Mothers used it to quiet children, soldiers used it to quiet memories, and housewives used it to quiet everything else. It was prescribed for hysteria, cholera, colic, neuralgia, and the moral inconveniences of being human. It became the liquid punctuation of the age, a full stop after too much feeling. The Victorians, who prided themselves on discipline, treated laudanum as a loophole. You could endure the stress of empire, industry, and repression all day, then pour yourself a small, socially acceptable collapse at night. Doctors praised it, clergymen tolerated it, and poets wrote it, love letters disguised as metaphors. The only ones who worried were the chemists who realized the dosage kept rising while the relief did not. In the laboratories of the early 19th century, scientists began to isolate the plant's active essence. They were not content with muddy syrups and poetic uncertainty. They wanted clarity in crystal form. Around 1805, a German pharmacist named Friedrich Serturner managed to extract the pure substance from opium. He named it morphium after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. It was an elegant decision, though in hindsight perhaps too prophetic. Serturner's discovery was revolutionary. A few grains of morphine could equal an entire dose of laudanum. Doctors rejoiced. Patients swooned. The pharmaceutical industry stirred in its cradle. At last, science had captured the poppy's spirit and bottled its soul. They didn't yet realize that souls are slippery things to contain. Back in the parlors of Europe, addiction grew quietly, as discreetly as wallpaper. Housewives became forgetful, poets became vague, and doctors became indispensable. To be indisposed was to have both a reason and a remedy. In respectable circles, nobody was an addict. Everyone was simply unwell. The irony was that while the empires fought to control opium abroad, they were losing the same battle at home. The difference was one of presentation. In India and China, opium was a vice. In Britain, it was a tincture. The bottle hid what the chest once revealed. You can almost picture a London evening around 1850. Gaslight trembling against fogged windows, a child coughing in the next room, a mother measuring a dose in a silver spoon. The sound of liquid pouring, the soft exhale as the bottle is stoppered again. A moment later, silence. The peace that comes not from faith, but from chemistry. The industrial age was learning to anesthetize itself. Steam engines roared, telegraphs clicked, factories glowed, and beneath all that noise, people were quietly numbing their nerves with imported comfort. Pain, once a natural part of living, was becoming an inconvenience to be managed. It was the beginning of the modern idea that suffering could be optional, at least for those who could afford it. Yet the relief had a price, as it always does. Doctors began noticing nervous exhaustion, melancholic dependency, and other polite euphemisms for a problem no one wanted to name. They prescribed smaller doses, safer tonics, holidays by the sea, anything that avoided the truth. Meanwhile, factories churned out bottles faster than sermons could warn against them. By the century's end, the British Isles alone were consuming tons of opium per year, most of it dissolved in something sweet and labelled as medicine. The empire that once used the poppy to discipline Asia was now dosing itself into tranquility. It was a kind of moral symmetry. Every empire eventually inhales its own exports. Still, for millions of people, laudanum was not sin or scandal. It was survival. It dulled the toothache, soothed the cough, silenced the nightmares. It gave comfort to mothers, courage to soldiers, and vocabulary to poets. It was both balm and betrayal, a love story written in amber glass. And in laboratories far from the poets' garrets, chemists were still refining the formula, searching for something purer, safer, stronger. They would find it soon. A needle would replace the spoon, and salvation would travel faster than ever before. For now the lamps burned low, the bottle stood half empty, and the night was mercifully quiet. Europe slept, dreaming the same dream its empires had once sold overseas, the dream of pain without consequence. By the middle of the 19th century, the world had learned to trust science the way it once trusted saints. Laboratories replaced altars, and glassware replaced prayer. In these bright rooms filled with beakers and ambition, humanity decided it could improve even its oldest mistakes. Opium, that ancient and unreliable comfort, was about to become efficient. Chemists, especially in Germany and France, were busy dismantling nature and rebuilding it into progress. They took the messy brown latex of the poppy and filtered, boiled, and distilled it until only its essence remained. Small white crystals that shimmered like innocence. This purified form was called morphine, after Morpheus, the god of dreams. A fitting name for a substance that allowed people to drift away from pain and return when it suited them. Morphine arrived just in time for the Industrial Revolution's most productive companion, the wars of the 19th century. Soldiers who once endured pain with grim poetry now had chemistry on their side. During the American Civil War alone, hundreds of thousands of soldiers received injections of morphine to ease their wounds. It was faster than prayer and easier to measure. Some joked that it was the only thing both sides agreed on. Doctors marvelled at the new invention that carried morphine even deeper into the human body, the hypodermic syringe. Introduced in the 1850s, it looked simple enough. A glass tube, a plunger, and a thin needle that turned relief into a matter of seconds. It was as if pain had finally met its match. For the first time in history, suffering could be paused with precision. But, as always, the pause button came with no clear instructions for stopping. The needle made morphine personal. You didn't need to swallow or sip. You could deliver relief directly into the bloodstream, bypassing both caution and reflection. Surgeons adored it. So did patients. So did everyone who discovered that the same tool that dulled agony could also erase sadness. By the end of the century, doctors had a new term for the result: the soldier's disease, describing veterans who couldn't stop chasing the peace they had found in hospitals. The name was compassionate, if not particularly honest. In parlours and clinics alike, morphine became the respectable descendant of laudanum. The amber bottles now came with labels written in the confident tone of modernity. Scientifically prepared, doctor-approved, guaranteed purity. Addiction was still treated as a character flaw rather than a chemical one. Dependence was not a diagnosis. It was a personality trait, and then, inevitably, someone tried to make it better. In 1898, a young chemist working for Bayer, a German pharmaceutical company better known at the time for dyes than for medicine, synthesized a new derivative of morphine. It seemed gentler, cleaner, more heroic. To mark the triumph, he named it heroin, from the German word heroisch, meaning strong or noble. It was marketed as the future of safe pain relief, a non-addictive alternative to morphine, and even a treatment for coughs and morphine dependency itself. It was the medical equivalent of promoting wine as a cure for alcoholism. Advertisements soon appeared in newspapers and pharmacies across Europe and America. Elegant posters featuring mothers giving spoonfuls of Bayer's heroin syrup to their children, or businessmen promising relief for nervous conditions. Doctors prescribed it freely for everything from sore throats to insomnia. Some recommended it to help patients stop using morphine. Others prescribed it to themselves for research purposes, which conveniently doubled as relaxation. It worked beautifully, until it didn't. Within a few years, reports began to appear of patients who couldn't stop taking it, whose tolerance rose until the medicine became the illness. Hospitals quietly adjusted their records. Doctors quietly changed subjects. By 1913, Bayer had withdrawn heroin from the market. less out of morality than embarrassment. It was an awkward discovery. The latest cure had inherited the same curse, only faster. While Europe was learning this painful irony, the world was also trying to organise its first international response. In 1909, delegates from 13 countries met in Shanghai to discuss what was politely called the Opium Question. The conversations were long, the tea excellent, and the resolutions weak. 3 years later, at The Hague, they tried again. The Hague Opium Convention of 1912 marked the first global attempt to regulate narcotics. It was, in essence, a treaty written in hindsight, an admission that progress occasionally needed supervision. But regulation moves slowly, and chemistry does not. In the years that followed, morphine and heroin continued to travel the world in steamer trunks and medical crates. They went to war once again, this time in World War I, where they filled soldiers' veins and doctors' field kits. Morphine became both comfort and curse on every front. It dulled the pain of shrapnel and heartbreak alike, and for many soldiers it became the only reliable thing left in a collapsing world. When the war ended, the soldiers brought their memories home, and the medicine too. The 20th century opened not with peace, but with withdrawal. Behind the parades and speeches of triumph, a quieter epidemic was taking shape. Painkillers had outlived the pain they were made for. The pattern was old but newly efficient. Discovery, celebration, denial, and regret. The poppy, once a flower, was now an industry. Its sap had become a language spoken fluently by doctors, soldiers, and dreamers alike. You can imagine a chemist standing in a white lab, staring at a vial of clear liquid, certain that this time humanity had outsmarted its cravings. You can imagine the same vial a decade later on a shelf in a dark room, waiting for someone who no longer believed in miracles but still needed one. Science had achieved what alchemy never could. It had distilled comfort itself. But comfort, it turned out, was just as addictive as opium ever was. By the early years of the 20th century, the laboratories of Europe and America were quietly closing their notebooks on the subject, turning instead to other molecules, other dreams. The poppy had been both conquered and released again, transformed into syringes and tablets, bottles and headlines. It was no longer a secret, it was a system. Humanity had finally found a way to bottle forgetfulness and sell it wholesale. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the world exhaled. The air was heavy with ashen victory, and for a moment everyone wanted to believe that the worst was behind them. But peace, like opium, has a way of being unevenly distributed. New borders were drawn, new ideologies rose, and in the corners of the map no one was watching. An old flower began to grow again, quietly, profitably, and under new management. The Cold War wasn't just a battle of ideas, it was a global contest for influence, fought with money, propaganda, and the occasional moral compromise disguised as strategy. In the highlands of Burma, Laos, and northern Thailand, a humid triangle of jungle and mist, the poppy found its next stage. The soil was perfect, the governments weak, and the mountains remote enough to hide 1,000 sins. Later, the region would earn a name that sounded like myth, the Golden Triangle. It began, as many tragedies do, with refugees and soldiers. When the Chinese Civil War ended in 1949, remnants of the defeated nationalist army, known as the KMT, fled south into Burma. They were supposed to regroup and one day retake China. Instead, they grew poppies. The fields they planted became their treasury, and opium their unofficial flag. The trade funded weapons, food, and a sense of purpose that exile alone could not provide. Meanwhile, far away in Washington, American officials saw an opportunity. The early Cold War was a time of paranoia, and the word communism could justify nearly anything. The KMT and other anti-communist forces in Southeast Asia suddenly became useful allies. According to later investigations, American intelligence agencies, including the CIA, looked the other way, or sometimes directly assisted, as opium revenues financed local armies loyal to Western interests. There were planes in the sky that didn't officially exist, flying routes that weren't on maps. One airline, nicknamed Air America, carried cargo that was sometimes food, sometimes weapons, and occasionally something more fragrant. Pilots joked about cargo that sleeps, though few laughed for long. The jungle turned into a laboratory of contradictions. The same governments that condemned opium in speeches were protecting its production in secret. In a war fought to win hearts and minds, a plant that calmed both seemed too useful to abandon. In these mountain valleys, warlords became businessmen and farmers became soldiers. Among the most notorious was Khun Sa, a charismatic leader who combined the charm of a general with the pragmatism of a banker. He controlled vast territories in Burma and later declared himself the King of Opium. His armies guarded the fields, his caravans moved the goods, and his profits ran into the hundreds of millions. Western newspapers called him a villain. His followers called him employment. For local farmers, the arrangement was simple. Poppies paid better than rice, and the world's demand was endless. Harvest season came once a year, when the monsoon clouds parted and the flowers opened like pale lamps over the hills. Workers would rise before dawn, cut small slits in the green pods, and return in the evening to scrape the dried sap. The smell was earthy and faintly sweet, like wet fruit. The resin was rolled into balls, packed into bamboo, and carried down the mountains on mule trains. Each step of that journey fed a different hunger, survival, greed, and the human need to believe that the ends justify the means. By the 1960s, the region was supplying most of the world's heroin. The Vietnam War gave it new customers. American soldiers stationed in Southeast Asia found heroin cheaper than beer and easier to find than sleep. Dealers called it China White, a name that sounded almost elegant, as if purity were a virtue in poison. By 1971, the US government estimated that tens of thousands of troops were addicted. Officials were shocked. The poppy, however, was not. It had simply followed the soldiers to work. The pattern repeated with painful precision. War created chaos. Chaos needed funding. Opium provided it. Once the money flowed, morality drifted downstream. The poppy had no politics. It bloomed equally well under kings, communists, and Democrats. All it required was soil, sunlight, and someone desperate enough to plant it. In Washington, officials gave the situation a new name: narcotics problem, as if renaming it could reduce its weight. Reports were written, committees formed, and speeches delivered about international cooperation. On the ground, the harvest continued. In the mountain villages of Laos and Burma, the economy was simple. A family could grow 1 acre of poppies and feed itself for a year. A field of rice fed the stomach. A field of opium fed everything else. Traders paid in cash, salt, or sometimes weapons. The same substance that numbed pain in hospitals was now financing guerrilla warfare and shaping geopolitics. The irony was so large that most people simply looked away. The world's newspapers occasionally printed photographs of the Golden Triangle: mist rising over the hills, farmers bending over fields, women carrying baskets of flowers. The images looked almost pastoral. What they didn't show were the laboratories hidden in the forests, where opium paste was boiled, filtered, and turned into heroin. These makeshift factories, run by chemists who had never attended school, produced tons of powder each year. It was the old alchemy again, converting despair into profit. Back in Europe and America, the addiction wave that began in Asia followed. Soldiers home. Heroin hit the streets of New York, Paris, and London, turning veterans into statistics and communities into cautionary tales. Governments blamed foreign traffickers blamed demand. The poppy, as always, remained silent. It's strange how history keeps finding ways to weaponize comfort. What began as a cure for pain had become a financial strategy, a military tool, and a political embarrassment. Yet through it all, the field stayed beautiful. In photographs, the poppies glowed under the tropical sun, indifferent to the headlines they caused. The Cold War, in the end, wasn't cold at all. It burned quietly, in jungles, in syringes, in the long corridors of diplomacy where men in suits spoke of freedom while their proxies traded flowers for bullets. And when the planes finally stopped flying, when the treaties were signed and the speeches delivered, the poppies still bloomed. Empires came and went. Ideologies shifted like clouds, but the plant, resilient and patient, waited for its next employer. The war had ended, at least on paper. The habit had not. When a war ends, the speeches always sound cleaner than the soil it leaves behind. In the mountains of Southeast Asia, where mist lingers longer than peace, the poppy continued to bloom. The jungles had been renamed, reorganised, and redrawn on maps, but the fields didn't care. They kept their own calendar, a quiet rhythm of planting, cutting, scraping, and survival. By the 1970s, the world began to notice the contradiction. The same governments that had once tolerated or even used the opium trade to fight communism were now declaring it the new enemy. Newspapers spoke of narcotics wars, a phrase that neatly avoided saying who the soldiers were. International agencies led by the United Nations announced campaigns to eradicate the poppy and replace it with legitimate crops, coffee, corn, or hope. Helicopters circled above the hills, dropping pamphlets instead of bombs. On paper, it all looked noble. But in the villages, the reality was simpler. Each plant represented a week's food, or a child's school fees, or a roof that didn't leak. A farmer could grow rice and earn a few coins, or grow opium and earn enough to survive the next drought. When officials came to explain that the flower was forbidden, the farmers nodded politely, then planted again. For them, the real economy was hunger. A field of poppies is a strangely beautiful sight. A carpet of white and red swaying under tropical sun, delicate as porcelain. From above it looks like art. On the ground it smells faintly of sleep. You can hear the faint scrape of blades at dawn as the workers cut shallow lines into the green pods, a gesture both tender and desperate. The latex oozes out, dries in the heat, and is scraped away in the evening, rolled into dark crumbs of future wealth. The process is simple, rhythmic, and quietly heartbreaking. Governments called it crime. The farmers called it insurance. In the 1980s and 90s, the Golden Triangle became a battlefield of bureaucracy. The United Nations sent experts, economists, and polite optimism. They spoke of alternative development, a phrase that meant, please stop growing what we buy illegally. International funding built roads, schools, and pilot projects for new crops. Some of it worked, briefly. Most of it dissolved in the rain. In one report, a Burmese farmer was quoted saying, "They tell us to grow coffee, but coffee does not cry when the baby is hungry." It was not defiance, it was mathematics. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the demand for heroin was stronger than ever. Western cities were fighting their own epidemics. Addicts filled hospitals and prisons. Politicians made speeches about the scourge from Asia, ignoring that their own policies had once fertilized those same fields. The poppy had outlasted every justification. It no longer needed an ideology. It was a global business that traded equally in comfort and hypocrisy. Some governments tried burning the fields, others sprayed chemicals from the sky, leaving behind scorched patches of earth and villages that smelled faintly of gasoline. For every acre destroyed, another appeared further up the valley. The plant had learned to migrate like a fugitive. Destroying the crop was like trying to outlaw rain. And yet, amid this endless tug of war, there were quiet victories and quieter losses. Some communities managed to switch to other livelihoods: orchards, handicrafts, small cooperatives. The success stories were photographed and printed in glossy reports. The failures stayed in the mountains, uncounted. The truth was uncomfortable. For many farmers, poppies were not a choice but a necessity disguised as sin. By the end of the century, heroin production in the Golden Triangle had begun to decline, not because the world had won, but because another player had entered the game. Afghanistan, torn apart by its own wars, took the lead. The global market had simply changed suppliers. The problem had moved, not vanished. Still, the image of those mountain fields lingers. Tourists who visit northern Thailand today sometimes see remnants of the old plantations, now rebranded as cultural exhibits. Guides explain the history softly, as if apologising for the landscape. They show the tools, the knives, the trays, the small metal weights used to measure resin. The past is presented as a lesson, though the lesson itself remains unlearned. The politics of poppies are simple to describe and impossible to solve. The plant grows where states are weak and lives are cheaper than laws. It thrives on contradiction, condemned by governments, protected by necessity, and consumed by the very nations that claim to fight it. The real war was never between farmers and officials. It was between ideals and appetites. To the villagers, the helicopters overhead were a reminder that the world remembered them only when it wanted something. To the politicians, the poppy fields were a statistic, acres of embarrassment to be reduced, reported, and filed away. And to the poppy itself, none of it mattered. It had survived Sumer, Rome, the Mughals, and the British Empire. Bureaucracy was just another kind of weather. If you listen carefully to the rustle of leaves, the soft thud of the scraping knives, the sigh of distant thunder, you can almost hear the plant thinking. It doesn't speak in words, but if it did, it might say, "I do not choose who I serve. I only grow where pain pays well." By the early 2000s, satellite images showed the poppy fields shrinking in Southeast Asia, replaced by forests or other crops. The world declared progress. Conferences were held, medals awarded, graphs printed. But somewhere far away, new fields were already blooming under a different flag. Humanity had shifted its guilt, not erased it. The flower doesn't care who governs or which currency buys the harvest. It grows toward the light, and the light, inconveniently, is always there. By the late 1970s, the world had grown tired of the wars that announced themselves. The next one would begin quietly, in the folds of mountains where history hides and dust never settles. Afghanistan had long been a crossroads for travellers, conquerors, and forgotten maps. It was a place where empires came to test their endurance and left with their illusions bruised. And in 1979, another empire arrived, the Soviet Union, bringing tanks, ideology, and an almost touching faith that geography could be persuaded to cooperate. The invasion turned Afghanistan into a landscape of contradictions, ancient villages beneath new machinery, prayer calls drowned out by helicopters, and poppy fields blooming in the shadows of war. The Soviets came to install order. What they created instead was economy, a war economy built on dust, determination, and something far older than either communism or capitalism, the poppy. For centuries, farmers in the Afghan highlands had cultivated the plant in modest quantities, selling it for medicine or local trade. But when the war began, cash became as scarce as peace. Armies needed food, weapons, and loyalty. Opium, dried and portable, became the simplest form of currency. The Mujahideen, local fighters resisting Soviet occupation, discovered that the flower could finance their faith. Across the border in Pakistan, new laboratories emerged, small and secretive, where the sticky brown opium was transformed into white heroin. It was chemistry done with buckets and kerosene, improvised and efficient. From there, the finished product travelled west, through Iran, Turkey, and into Europe, a river of powder flowing toward the same cities that once drank tea bought with China's suffering. The profits from this trade did not stay in the mountains. They bought weapons, radios, and sometimes loyalties. Western, Intelligence agencies, seeing in the Mujahideen a convenient enemy of their enemy, turned a blind eye to the source of their funding. The logic was painfully simple. If the poppy helped bleed the Soviet Union, then the ends would justify the harvest. In Washington, this was called strategy. In the valleys of Helmand and Nangarhar, it was just survival. By the mid-1980s, Afghanistan's opium production had tripled. The fields stretched across hillsides like pale smoke frozen in place. Helicopters thundered above them, but the plants didn't flinch. Farmers rose before dawn, slit the pods, and whispered prayers to a god who had surely grown weary of choosing sides. The scene must have looked timeless, bent figures scraping sap under a copper sun, the wind carrying the faint scent of resin and soil. But everything about it was new. The scale, the buyers, the invisible web connecting these mountain valleys to nightclubs in Paris, alleyways in New York and hospitals in London. The world's appetite had become the Mujahideen's treasury. At checkpoints, fighters collected a tax on every kilogram that left the region. The money bought rifles, ammunition, and occasionally roads. The same convoys that smuggled heroin out brought weapons in. The poppy had evolved again, from medicine to luxury, from luxury to necessity, and now to ammunition. It was an old lesson dressed in camouflage. When ideology runs short of funds, agriculture will find a way. The Soviet soldiers, many barely older than the fields themselves, rarely understood what they were fighting. They patrolled valleys that smelled of wildflowers and gunpowder, where every silence felt like a trick. In their reports, they mentioned narcotics production as an afterthought, a side effect of chaos. Few realised that those same crops were financing the resistance that made their occupation unbearable. When the Soviets finally withdrew in 1989, the headlines celebrated victory for the Afghan fighters and their foreign backers. But the victory was as brittle as the land itself. The country was left full of weapons, empty of infrastructure, and deeply dependent on the only reliable export it had left. The war had ended, but the harvest had just begun. In the 1990s, as Afghanistan fell into civil conflict, opium became the only stable institution. The warlords who replaced governments understood its value. Fields were taxed, trade routes protected, and laboratories expanded. The poppy had no politics. It served whoever paid for protection. For a time, it was the only thing that worked. From above, the valleys looked peaceful, neat rows of green plants under the pale blue sky. But if you walked through them, you could hear the faint hum of generators in hidden refineries, the metallic rattle of tin barrels, and the nervous conversations of men whose futures depended on invisible markets. The flower had made the nation self-sufficient in despair. Western journalists occasionally parachuted in to report on the heroin trail, writing about the strange marriage of faith and narcotics. They described fighters pausing between prayers to oversee the harvest, unaware that the contradiction wasn't theirs alone. Across the ocean, the same drug was creeping through Western streets, claiming new addicts who didn't know their habits helped fund a war half a world away. The circle had closed. If you ask why the poppy always seems to return to battlefields, the answer is simple. War and addiction both thrive on repetition. Each needs the illusion of control, the promise that the next time will be different. In Afghanistan, that illusion grew as naturally as the crop itself. By the time the world noticed the connection, it was too late. Entire economies had taken root in the soil of conflict. A generation of farmers had grown up knowing only one reliable livelihood. Children could recognise a poppy pod before they could write their names. And yet, amid the ruins, life persisted. Goats grazed along the edges of mined roads. Women carried water jars past the fields. Children chased kites against a wind that smelled faintly of resin and dust. The human instinct to continue, even while surrounded by contradictions, might be the only force stronger than history. As the sun set behind the jagged hills, the light turned the poppy fields gold, a cruelly beautiful sight. Each petal caught the last warmth of the day, each shadow lengthened like an old promise. These were the same fields that had once fed empires, now feeding revolutions, the same crop that once filled palaces now financed insurgents hiding in caves, and above it all the wind carried no judgment, only the low, tired sigh of continuity. When the last Soviet tanks rolled out of Afghanistan in 1989, the mountains exhaled, but the breath was not relief, only space for the next occupier. Civil war followed like weather. Factions splintered, alliances dissolved, and amid the chaos, the poppy remained the only reliable institution. It didn't take sides, didn't vote, didn't negotiate. It simply grew wherever the soil was disturbed, which in Afghanistan meant everywhere. By the mid-1990s, a new force rose from the confusion: the Taliban. They were students of religion who believed they could purify what war had corrupted. Their rules were strict, their justice immediate, their clothing and promises both unadorned. They banned music, television and laughter that lasted too long. Yet even this Puritan movement understood economics. Faith could feed the soul, but not an army. At first, the Taliban treated opium like a necessary sin. They allowed farmers to grow it and taxed each harvest by roughly 1/10 of its value. The money funded their administration, their roads, their wars, and their certainty. In rural villages, traders paid these taxes without complaint, a small price for order in a land allergic to stability. By the late 1990s, Afghanistan had become the world's largest supplier of opium. From the air, the fields looked like pale scars stitched into the brown landscape. Convoys of donkeys and trucks carried sacks of dried resin south to Pakistan, where refineries turned it into heroin. From there, it crossed oceans and customs officers with equal ease, eventually reaching the veins of distant strangers. The global response was predictably conflicted. Western governments condemned the Taliban for allowing drug production, but quietly noted that a stable trade was at least predictable. Predictability in international policy often ranks higher than virtue. Then, in 2000, the Taliban surprised everyone, including themselves. Their leader, Mullah Omar, announced a total ban on opium cultivation. He framed it as a moral decision, a religious duty to cleanse the nation. The decree spread quickly across the provinces, carried by clerics, rumours, and the quiet fear of punishment. Farmers obeyed. Within months, the fields lay bare. The following year's harvest fell by more than 90%, the sharpest drop in narcotics production ever recorded. The world applauded cautiously. For the first time in living memory, the poppy seemed to have met its match. Photographs showed barren fields, farmers turning to wheat and melons. United Nations officials called it a historic success. Western diplomats described it as proof that moral conviction could achieve what decades of aerial spraying and funding had not. But the story, as usual, was less straightforward. Many analysts later argued that the Taliban's ban was not purely moral but tactical. Stockpiles of opium had already been collected by traders and commanders close to the leadership. When the global supply shrank, the value of those reserves soared. The ban turned scarcity into profit. Morality, once again, was good for business. And then the towers fell. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the United States and its allies invaded Afghanistan, toppling the Taliban in a matter of weeks. The world celebrated the liberation, though the mountains barely noticed. In the power vacuum that followed, farmers planted again. With the Taliban gone and the new government too fragmented to enforce anything, the poppy returned with the enthusiasm of a forgiven sin. By 2004, Afghanistan was producing more opium than ever before. The fields stretched across provinces like a returning tide. Western soldiers patrolled roads lined with the same flowers their countries had once fought to eradicate. The irony was thick enough to taste. Reports from the early years of occupation read like parables of futility. In one village, American soldiers destroyed a field by burning it, only to see it replanted weeks later. In another, local police confiscated opium from farmers during the day and sold it back to them at night. The new Afghan government, struggling for legitimacy, relied on the same networks of tribal leaders who profited from the trade. Everyone condemned the flower, and everyone depended on it. By 2007, Afghanistan supplied more than 90% of the world's opium. The profits funded not only the Taliban's insurgency, but also corrupt officials, smugglers, and occasionally the very militias paid to fight them. The war on terror had developed a quiet side hustle, a war on sleep. Western newspapers published photos of soldiers standing in poppy fields, rifles slung casually over their shoulders, the flowers glowing pink and white beneath a flawless blue sky. The captions spoke of counterinsurgency and agricultural aid. The images spoke of déjà vu. To understand why the poppy persists, you have to understand its simplicity. It requires little water, no machines, and almost no trust in institutions. It asks nothing from the state except to be left alone. In a country where roads crumble, governments collapse, and promises age quickly, the poppy offers something rare: consistency. For the farmers, it was not ideology but arithmetic. A hectare of wheat might bring $60. A hectare of opium could bring 10 times that. It was not a moral calculation, it was a survival one. Every year, foreign officials arrived with clipboards and translators to lecture about the dangers of narcotics. Every year, the same officials flew home at the end of the season, and the seeds went back into the ground. The longer the occupation lasted, the more surreal it became. Western aid agencies spent billions to promote alternative livelihoods, yet the poppy continued to bloom, quietly ignoring press conferences. It was the only crop that could compete with despair. By the time the foreign armies began their withdrawal 2 decades later, Afghanistan's economy was addicted to the same substance as much of the world. Heroin profits financed the insurgency that fought the occupiers who funded the programs that tried to stop it. The cycle was so perfect it could almost be admired, if it weren't also tragic. When analysts later calculated the cost of the war, the money spent, the lives lost, the promises broken, they forgot to include the price of irony. A war on terror that couldn't win its war on sleep. As the last foreign planes left the Afghan sky, the fields turned green again. The harvest would come as it always did. Children would grow up, learn the careful art of cutting the pods at dawn, and hear stories about invaders who once promised peace. The wind would carry the same resin-sweet scent across the valleys, a perfume of memory and resignation. Empires, revolutions, armies, they all passed. The poppy remained. It had learned patience from mountains and profit from men. By the time the 21st century opened its doors, the old empires had crumbled, but their habits had survived. The poppy no longer needed fields, wars, or gunboats. Its spirit had found a new home, inside a pill bottle neatly labelled and approved by regulators. What had once been smuggled across borders was now prescribed across America. The chemistry hadn't changed. Only the marketing had learned to smile. In the 1990s, a company called Purdue Pharma introduced a new painkiller named OxyContin. The idea was elegant. A slow-release tablet containing oxycodone, a laboratory cousin of morphine. On paper, it was meant to relieve chronic pain without creating dependency. The company promoted it as safe, modern, and compassionate. Medicine for a society that feared discomfort more than death. Doctors were told the pills released their dose over 12 hours, like a slow drip of mercy. Advertisements showed smiling patients returning to golf courses and family dinners, their suffering resolved through science and optimism. Representatives visited hospitals and clinics with charts, samples, and promises. They spoke softly about quality of life, a phrase that sounded humane enough to silence doubt. But inside the body, the story was different. The coating dissolved faster than advertised. The slow drip became a quick flood. The brain's receptors, those small gates of pleasure and calm learned the pattern too well. They began to crave the next wave before the first one faded. It was chemistry at its most human. Relief becoming routine, routine becoming hunger. Dependence crept in quietly. Patients who had taken OxyContin after surgery or injury found themselves counting hours, then minutes, between doses. Doctors increased prescriptions, assuming the pain must have worsened. Pharmacies stayed busy, communities grew quiet. The pills worked so well that stopping them felt impossible. In small towns across America, medicine cabinets became gateways. Families who had never heard of heroin were suddenly speaking its language. People crushed the tablets to release the rush faster. Others melted them and used syringes. The company's brochures had promised 12 hours of comfort. They had not mentioned eternity. For a few years, it seemed like prosperity with better lighting. Pharmacies opened new branches. Pain clinics flourished. Politicians praised the miracle of modern medicine. There were television commercials showing grandparents gardening again, nurses smiling, life restored. Nobody wanted to ask restored to what. When the first overdoses appeared, they were treated as tragic accidents. Personal failures, not structural ones. The narrative stayed polite for as long as possible, but soon the numbers became too large for euphemisms. Counties once known for coal and timber were now known for funerals. Addiction, the word long reserved for distant strangers, had moved into the suburbs. The mechanisms of addiction were simple enough to describe but unbearable to watch. Each dose triggered the release of tiny chemical messengers in the brain, telling the body that all was well. Over time, those messengers stopped arriving naturally. The body outsourced happiness to the pill. Without it, pain wasn't just physical, it was existential. People weren't chasing euphoria anymore, they were chasing normal. Purdue insisted the crisis was caused by misuse, not design. The distinction was thin. The company's sales soared, and so did the number of addicts. Lawsuits would come later, long after the damage had seeped into every family tree. For a while, America was both patient and dealer, prescribing, consuming, and condemning itself in equal measure. When regulations finally tightened and doctors reduced prescriptions, the supply chain shifted. Patients cut off from OxyContin turned to something cheaper and familiar: heroin. The transition was almost seamless. The dealer replaced the pharmacist, the alley replaced the clinic. It was the same molecule wearing different clothes. In one county in West Virginia, overdose deaths rose faster than births. Churches held vigils where hymns mixed with the faint rattle of pill bottles carried as relics. Parents spoke about their children in the past tense while still hoping for calls. There was no language for a loss so widespread yet so invisible. The irony, as always, was clinical. The drug had been invented to end pain, and it had succeeded, though not as intended. The United States, a nation that prided itself on productivity, had accidentally engineered a form of absence so efficient it could empty entire towns. The economy of comfort had devoured its customers. Behind the statistics were moments too small for graphs. A nurse finding a patient asleep with eyes open. A mother discovering a prescription in her child's pocket. A doctor staring at a chart realizing he'd been treating the same ache for years and had only taught it new tricks. These were not stories of villains and victims, but of chemistry colliding with loneliness. Even as lawsuits mounted and Purdue declared bankruptcy, the pills remained. Generics, substitutes, the next wave of miracles. Addiction had been privatized, then outsourced. Pharmacies no longer sold opium, but they sold its descendants in every dosage imaginable. Somewhere in all this, the flower had finally achieved what empires once dreamed of: complete globalization. It no longer needed climate or soil, only prescription pads and insurance codes. The sap of Sumer had turned into white tablets stamped with numbers, measured not in milligrams but in consequences. The advertisements had promised life without pain. Nobody specified for how long. In fluorescent hospitals across the world, late-night corridors still hum with the same old story. A nurse pushes a cart of medications. A patient presses a button for relief. The machine delivers the dose with perfect accuracy, perfect timing, and no judgment. Outside, the wind moves through parking lots lined with sleeping cars. Inside, everything is bright and sterile and quiet. Pain has been conquered, but no one looks particularly happy about it. The poppy was never sentimental. When fields burned, it adapted. When wars ended, it found new ones. And when medicine stopped growing it in the soil, chemistry quietly took over. The flower no longer needed sunlight or rain. It only needed curiosity. In sterile labs and unmarked factories, scientists learned to build its spirit from scratch. What began as a plant had become an equation. Fentanyl was born in the 1960s, a laboratory attempt to make morphine safer and stronger. Two goals that have never peacefully coexisted. A Belgian chemist, calm and well-intentioned, created it as a surgical anaesthetic. Just a tiny dose could dull the body's senses without needing much volume. Hospitals embraced it for precision. It was clean, efficient, and easy to control, in theory. The molecule was simple enough to reproduce. Its consequences were not. Fentanyl was about 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. But no one thought in numbers. Pharmacologists saw it as progress. Less material for more relief. They called it a miracle of modern analgesia. It was a phrase that looked good in journals and aged badly in obituaries. At first, the drug lived quietly inside hospitals, moving from operating rooms to ambulances. Then, in the 1990s, pharmaceutical companies began selling fentanyl in patches and lozenges for chronic pain. It was the perfect product for a tired world. Invisible, precise, and invisible again. For patients who had built up tolerance to older opioids, it offered a final reprieve, a way to stay ahead of suffering. But the line between medical marvel and catastrophe is usually one distributor away. In the 2010s, illicit labs in China and later Mexico began manufacturing their own versions. Unlike heroin, fentanyl didn't need farmers or fields. It could be made entirely indoors, in batches small enough to fit in a backpack and strong enough to supply a city. The poppy had gone digital. Traffickers mixed fentanyl into counterfeit pills, cocaine, and heroin, often without telling buyers. A single grain too many could silence breathing in minutes. Police reports began to describe overdoses in terms of dust, amounts too small to measure, too powerful to ignore. It was, as one coroner said, a poison that doesn't know it's poison. In North America, the numbers rose like a grim tide. Every year, more people died of overdoses than the year before. Every new restriction on prescription opioids drove more demand into the street market. The supply chain adjusted instantly as if guided by instinct. The chemistry that once fueled empires now travelled by mail, wrapped in bubble envelopes and optimism. On the internet, dealers and users met in encrypted chat rooms and dark market storefronts. They paid with digital currency, tracked packages, and reviewed sellers like any other customers. Addiction had learned to code. The modern poppy didn't bloom in soil, it bloomed in data centres. The supply routes were invisible, the merchants faceless, and the victims countless. Governments called it a crisis, though the word implies something temporary. For those living through it, it felt more like climate. Everywhere, continuous, and impossible to escape. Cities installed vending machines that dispensed clean needles. Libraries stocked naloxone, the antidote that could restart breathing if used in time. On some nights, paramedics revived the same person twice. For many, fentanyl became not a pursuit of pleasure, but an attempt to stop withdrawal, a chemical prayer to keep the pain just far enough away. It was efficient, reliable, and absolute. One dose too much, and the body simply forgot to return from its brief vacation. Families found their loved ones in bedrooms, cars, public bathrooms, each scene eerily tidy, as if the person had meant to wake up. In laboratories and government offices, experts spoke of solutions, better treatment, tighter laws, smarter education. But underneath, the same old equation persisted. The world still wanted relief faster than it wanted understanding. Demand was infinite, and the supply had become limitless. The poppy, once a flower of the earth, had become a ghost in the machine. It moved without sunlight, without scent, without even a name in common speech. No farmer tended it, no priest blessed it. It grew where pain was data and delivery was automated. A single synthetic batch, no larger than a shoebox, could end thousands of lives or sustain millions of habits. The difference depended on intention, a fragile variable at best. If ancient Sumerians had harvested dreams from a sap, their descendants were now harvesting them from algorithms. The continuity is almost elegant. 5,000 years of trying to forget, improved by technology, but never by wisdom. Some scientists believe fentanyl may one day lead to safer analgesics, drugs that treat pain without seduction. Others quietly admit that pain is too profitable to disappear. Either way, the chemistry continues. The molecule has no opinion. It simply does what it was designed to do. In the meantime, the rituals remain unchanged. A patient presses a button for relief. A courier ships a parcel. A family receives a call in the middle of the night. The setting changes. Temples, battlefields, clinics, chat rooms. But the prayer is the same. Make the pain stop just for a while. 5,000 years after Sumer, the joy plant no longer needs a garden, only demand. And that is how pain became a business that never sleeps.